They say family always opens its doors to you. Mine didn't. After 9 hours behind the wheel and a lifetime of giving, I stood on my son's porch holding a box filled with our family's history, maps my grandfather once drew by lantern light. But my son wasn't there. His fiancée smiled, calm and polite, and said, "The dinner was yesterday." Yesterday. That single word cracked something in me. Because that night, sitting alone in a motel room with those mats spread across the bed, I realized something no parent wants to admit. Sometimes the people you raised forget who built the ground they're standing on. And what I did next changed everything they thought they owned. The morning I left, the sky looked tired, like it hadn't fully decided whether to be day or night. I packed light, one small suitcase, a thermos of coffee, and a wooden box wrapped in an old wool blanket. Inside were 3 maps, drawn more than 70 years ago by my grandfather's steady hand. He traced those lines when our family worked the small freight routes through the back roads of Missouri, back when a handshake meant something and a promise lasted longer than money ever could. He gave those maps to my father. My father passed them to me, and now I wanted to give them to my son, Elias. When Elias was little, he used to sit on my lap and trace those same routes with his tiny fingers. He'd ask, "Where do these roads go?" And I'd say, "Home, if you remember how to follow them." He'd grin every time, like he understood something I didn't. Maybe I believed that grin too much. Maybe I thought love was enough to keep us connected. The highway stretched out in front of me, endless gray ribbon curling through quiet towns and rusted signs. I wasn't tired, just steady. Every mile felt like a small promise. It had been months since I'd seen him. Too many short calls, too many, "We'll talk soon, Mom." But this dinner felt different. An engagement, a new beginning, the kind of night where a mother gets to pass something down. Not just a box of maps, but a piece of history. The box sat beside me the entire way, like an old friend who refused to leave my side. Sometimes I glanced over and imagined his face when I handed it to him, that same spark of wonder he had when he was 5. By the time I turned onto the last stretch of road, I could already picture us sitting around the table, the maps spread open, his fiancée smiling politely as I told stories about where we came from. But life has a cruel way of changing the ending before you even arrive. Because what waited for me behind that door wasn't a celebration. It was a lesson I'll never forget. By the time I reached Elias's street, the daylight had thinned into that quiet blue that makes everything look colder than it is. His house stood at the end of the lane, modern, bright, and nothing like the home he grew up in. No porch swing, no muddy boots by the steps, just clean glass and silence. I parked at the curb, took a deep breath, and lifted the box from the passenger seat. It felt heavier now, though I knew it wasn't the wood or paper that weighed it down. It was hope. Years of it. When I reached the door, I could hear laughter inside. It sounded close, familiar, warm, until I realized it wasn't meant for me. Then the door opened. Clara stood there, perfect posture, a dress too nice for an ordinary evening. Her smile flickered when she saw me, the kind of smile people use when they're trying to remember your name. "Nora," she said softly. "Oh, you're here." "I made it. I brought something for the engagement dinner." She blinked, hesitated, then said, "Oh, right, the dinner. That was yesterday." Yesterday. I must have misheard. I asked,
What do you mean yesterday? She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear like it would make the words sound kinder. She said, "It just worked out better for everyone. My parents were in town. It was kind of last minute."
I stood there, gripping that box like it could anchor me. Inside, someone laughed again, louder this time. Glasses clinked. A man's voice told a joke, but my son's voice never came. Clara looked over her shoulder, then back at me. "They're still cleaning up," she said, her tone polite but final. "It's been such a busy day. Maybe you can stop by another time." Another time. That's what people say when they really mean not today. I nodded because it was easier than begging. The door closed softly, like it was afraid of making noise. And just like that, I was standing outside again, 9 hours from home, holding the past in my hands, while the future laughed behind a wall. I walked back to my car slowly. The air felt heavier now. I sat there for a long while, the box resting between us like an unspoken truth. When I finally turned the key, I didn't cry. I just stared through the windshield and thought about every road my family ever mapped and how not one of them had prepared me for this. The motel was one of those roadside places with humming lights and thin curtains that never quite close. I checked in without saying much. The clerk handed me a key like it weighed nothing. Funny how people never notice when you're carrying a lifetime. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaner. I placed the box on the bed, turned off the lamp, then sat beside it. For a long time, I just listened to the heater clicking, to cars passing somewhere beyond the window, to the sound of a woman trying not to fall apart. Eventually, I opened the box. The maps unfolded like memories, creases deep, edges frayed. Each one carried my family's handwriting, rivers marked in pencil, routes drawn through towns that barely exist anymore. I traced a line with my finger the way Elias used to when he was little. He'd always stop halfway and ask, "Where does this road end?" And I'd tell him, "It doesn't, it just keeps finding new turns." Tonight, those roads felt like questions I couldn't answer. Somewhere between the ink and the paper, I saw what I'd refused to see for years. How quiet my life had become while I waited for him to call, to visit, to remember. How many birthdays I'd cooked for two, how many times I'd said, "He's busy," just to protect the lie that love was enough. The clock on the wall ticked loud, stubborn, alive. And something inside me shifted with it. A thought, small at first, but sharp. Maybe these maps weren't meant for a family that no longer saw their value. Maybe they were meant for someone who would. I folded them carefully and placed them back in the box. Then I whispered, not to Elias, not to anyone, just to the silence that had finally started listening. You can't lose what's already left you, but you can choose what you take back. When the morning came, I didn't feel broken. I felt lighter, like the road ahead wasn't an ending at all, just a new direction waiting to be drawn. By the time I got home, the house felt different. It wasn't emptier, it was honest. Silence had a way of telling the truth I'd ignored for too long. The wooden box sat on the kitchen table, the morning light crawling across it like it was trying to remind me it still existed. I made coffee, sat down, and stared at it. The ache from the drive had settled in my shoulders, but underneath the ache was something steadier. Something starting to wake up. That's when I saw it. An envelope I'd pushed aside weeks earlier, half buried under old mail. The return address was from the Regional Museum of Heritage and Trade, a place I used to help catalog historical maps before I retired. The director, Sylvia Hahn, had written me a letter. Her handwriting was still the same, careful, deliberate, like every loop had a purpose. She'd heard I still had rare family documents, drawings, records, maybe even trade maps. She asked kindly if I'd ever consider letting the museum preserve them. I remember reading it before and feeling it was too much, too heavy, too soon. But that morning it didn't feel heavy at all. It felt like timing. I read the letter again, once, then twice. And when I set it down, I wasn't thinking about Elias anymore. I was thinking about legacy, and how sometimes it doesn't live where it's born, it lives where it's seen. I called Sylvia. She picked up on the second ring, surprised but warm. "Nora, I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again."
I smiled at the sound of her voice. Maybe I wasn't ready before, but I am now. She didn't rush me. She just said, "When you're ready to bring them in, we'll make sure they're cared for." After the call, I sat there for a while, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt anchored. Sometimes it takes losing a place at someone else's table to remember you were never meant to sit quietly at the edge anyway. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window like it was trying too hard to look kind. I decided to start gathering everything for the museum. Old records, letters, certificates. I wanted the maps to arrive with their story intact. But as I reached into the drawer where I kept family documents, I found a thin folder that didn't belong there. Its label read, "Catskill Cabin." My breath caught. That cabin had been mine and Henry's safe place. The only property we'd bought outright long before Elias ever dreamed of business or success. We built that porch with our own hands. Every nail had a memory. I opened the folder expecting maintenance notes or tax slips. Instead, I saw a transfer of title. Not a copy, an official record. The cabin had been moved into an LLC called EC Holdings. My initials weren't there, but two others were. E for Elias, C for Clara. At first, my brain refused to translate what my eyes were reading. Maybe it was a mistake, some clerical mix-up. But as I read further, my heart began to hammer. A notary signature I didn't recognize, a witness I'd never met, and the one thing missing, the thing that screamed louder than any word, was my name. My signature had been forged. I set the paper down slowly, like it might bite. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I could still hear Clara's voice from that night. "We didn't think you'd be up for the travel." No, they hadn't wanted me to travel. They wanted me to stay quiet, out of the way. I walked to the window and stared at the lake behind my house. It looked calm, almost still, but I knew what was under the surface. Roots, mud, things that pulled hard when you tried to move too fast. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. It was a plan, and I had been too trusting to see it. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea I never drank and stared at the papers again. Every number, every line, every false signature. Then I whispered something I hadn't said in years. Enough. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. They thought silence meant surrender. They were about to learn it meant strategy. By noon the next day, I had a plan, or at least the outline of one. I wasn't going to call Elias. I wasn't going to ask for explanations or apologies. I needed facts, not family drama. The name Meredith Hall came to mind. We'd known each other years ago when she was still new at the local law office. Back then, I used to bring Henry's land contracts for her to review. Now she ran the place. If anyone could untangle this mess, it was her. The office sat on Main Street between a bakery and a tailor shop. The sign out front was faded, the kind of old that meant trustworthy. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and paper, that mix of comfort and consequence. The receptionist looked startled when I gave my name, but within minutes, Meredith stepped into the waiting room. Her hair had gone silver since I'd last seen her, but her eyes hadn't changed. Calm, steady, and sharp enough to cut through a lie.
She led me into her office and closed the door. Then she said gently, "All right, Nora, start from the beginning." So I did. The drive, the doorstep, the dinner that never was, and finally, the folder with the forged signature. She didn't interrupt once, didn't say, "Oh no," or "That can't be right." She just listened. And when I slid the papers across the desk, her face barely moved. Only her eyes darkened slightly. When she finished reading, she leaned back in her chair and said, "I've seen this before. Not this exact situation, but this pattern." "What pattern?" I asked. She sighed. "The quiet kind. When parents sign things they don't fully understand. When power of attorney documents appear by mistake. When assets move quietly into someone else's name." My stomach twisted. "So what can I do?" Meredith tapped the papers lightly with her pen. "First, we confirm what's been filed. Then we find out who authorized it. And Nora, don't speak to them. Not yet. Let's get the truth before you give them the satisfaction of your reaction." I nodded. It was the first time in days that my breathing felt even. She slid a business card across the desk. "Keep this close," she said, "and keep every document safe. If you have a home safe, use it." When I stepped outside, the air hit colder than before. The street was busy, kids laughing, cars moving, life carrying on. But everything felt sharper, clearer. I wasn't broken. I was awake. That night, I locked every document in my safe and double-checked the latch twice. Then I sat by the window with a notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. They took advantage of my silence. Now my silence will protect me. It wasn't rage that kept me up. It was resolve. Because sometimes reclaiming your life doesn't start with shouting. It starts with paperwork and a steady hand. The roads toward the Catskills felt narrower than I'd remembered, like they'd been waiting for me to come back. The leaves were just starting to turn, patches of gold and red scattered through the green like quiet sparks of forgiveness. I didn't pack much, just a small bag, the box of documents, and Henry's old letter I kept folded in my coat pocket. It had been years since I'd last been to the cabin. After Henry passed, I stopped going altogether. Too many ghosts in the floorboards. Too much silence that used to belong to us. But now, that silence was exactly what I needed. When I turned down the gravel path, the trees opened like old friends parting for one last secret. And there it was, the same little cabin we built with borrowed hands and borrowed hope. The porch still leaned to the left, the shutters still needed painting, and yet it stood strong. Like me.
I unlocked the door. The air inside was cool, musty,
familiar. Dust floated through sunlight like tiny, stubborn memories. I set my bag down and lit a fire. The wood cracked, slow and patient, and for the first time in months, I exhaled without shaking. Later, I sat at the kitchen table, the firelight flickering against the walls. I unfolded Henry's letter. The paper had softened with age, his handwriting still steady, the kind of writing that came from knowing who you are. He'd written it 3 weeks before he died. I never really understood it then, but now, every word made sense. Nora, it said, you are the keeper of what we built. Not the house, not the land, us. If the day ever comes when you feel erased, protect what's left of our story, even if it means walking away from those who stopped listening. I sat there for a long time, fire warming my face, his words warming something deeper. And I realized I wasn't here to hide. I was here to remember who I was before I forgot to fight for her. The next morning, I walked outside with the sun barely rising. Mist hung over the trees, and the lake looked like glass. I stood on the porch and whispered to the air, not like a prayer, but like a promise. This place is still mine. Then I went inside, took out my notebook, and began writing the next chapter. Not of my pain, but of my peace. When I came back from the cabin, the house felt colder than I remembered. Not because the temperature had dropped, but because I had changed. The woman who left was unsure. The woman who walked back through that door was done asking for permission. Clara was in the kitchen when I arrived, slicing lemons like she had all the time in the world. Elias sat at the table, eyes fixed on his laptop, the glow from the screen reflecting off the walls like artificial light in a place that used to feel warm. Neither of them looked up. That told me everything. I placed a small cardboard box on the counter, filled with framed photos I'd taken from the hallway. Birthdays, vacations, holidays. Each one had one thing in common: my face. I said, quietly but clearly, I'll be taking a trip for a few days. Elias finally looked up. Clara didn't. She just asked, will you be back for the wedding weekend? I smiled, soft and unbothered. We'll see. That night, I didn't sleep much. I packed one bag, put every legal document Meredith had gathered into my briefcase, and added Henry's letter on top. Before sunrise, I left again. No note, no explanation, just motion. But this time, I wasn't running from silence. I was moving with it. 3 days later, I returned. The air in the house had shifted, like even the walls were holding their breath. I had already filed the legal claim with Meredith. The title transfer, the forged signature, the LLC, all of it was now under official investigation. The cabin was mine again, at least for now. I didn't say a word to them yet. I wanted to watch what guilt looked like before it had a name. And I saw it, in the way Clara started avoiding my eyes, in the way Elias hesitated before saying good morning. They were waiting for me to explode, but I wasn't angry. I was precise. The real moment came 1 week later. A courier arrived with an envelope addressed to me from the county recorder's office. Clara picked it up from the porch, glanced at my name, and brought it into the kitchen. She tried to sound casual when she asked, "What's this about?" I opened it right in front of her. Inside was confirmation that the property was now under legal review and that I was recognized as the rightful owner pending investigation. Clara's face went pale. Elias walked in mid-conversation, saw the paper, and froze. He asked, "Mom, what is this?"
I looked him straight in the eye and said, "It's me getting my name back."
The room went silent. He tried to explain, talked about business plans and family investments and timing. Clara jumped in. "It was supposed to stay in the family. You were always going to benefit, Nora." I let them talk. When they finally ran out of excuses, I said, "You forged my name. You sold what wasn't yours. You didn't just take my property, you took my trust. And that's something I don't loan out twice." I reached for the envelope and folded it neatly. Then I looked at Elias, my son, and said the words that felt heavier than any courtroom. "You have 60 days to leave." He stared at the floor. Clara stared at me. Neither said a word. And in that silence, I felt something unshackle inside my chest. Not revenge, not triumph, just freedom. They thought they'd removed me from the picture, but all they really did was make room for me to stand in the frame alone. 2 months later, the house sounded different. Not quieter, cleaner. The kind of silence that feels earned. Elias and Clara were gone. The rooms they once filled with their half-smiles and business calls now held only sunlight and the faint ticking of Henry's old clock. I walked through each hallway slowly, touching the walls, as if reminding the house who it belonged to again. Peace didn't rush in all at once. It arrived in small ways, in the sound of the kettle, in the smell of rain through the open window, in knowing I didn't have to explain my existence anymore. Then, one morning, while clearing the old corkboard near the fridge, I noticed a photograph I hadn't touched in years. A Thanksgiving picture, taken before everything fell apart. In it, Elias and Clara were laughing. I was there too, my smile wide, my hand resting on Henry's shoulder. But the photo was sliced clean through the middle. My half was missing. That's when I knew what this had always been about. They hadn't just taken property. They'd erased me from the story. So I decided to write a new one. It started small. A visit to the town library, a few pages of notes, and a conversation with Meredith about nonprofit paperwork. We called it the Helena Project, named after my grandmother, who raised 5 children alone after the war and never once stopped believing in women's strength. The mission was simple: to help women over 60 rebuild their independence after being manipulated, dismissed, or financially controlled by their families. We started with a free legal clinic, just me, Meredith, and a retired accountant named June. Then came Ellie, a real estate broker who had once lost her home to her stepson's forged signature. She found us an office near the bus stop. Small, but reachable. By the second week, 6 women showed up. By the third, 12. Each with their own story. Each carrying the same invisible weight I once did. I didn't stand at a podium. I sat with them. I told them parts of my story. Not to relive it, but to release it. And one by one, they began to speak too. Some cried. Some laughed through tears. But all of them, by the end, sat a little taller.
A few months later, a reporter from the local paper wrote about us. A quiet article, tucked between city updates and classifieds. But that small story reached big hearts. Soon, a woman from the PBS affiliate called. Her name was Michelle Everett, and she asked if I'd speak at their annual Women's Legacy Night. At first, I hesitated, but then I remembered something Henry once said before he passed. We don't build things to be remembered. We build them so others can start from where we stopped. So I said yes. The night of the event, I wore Henry's navy scarf and my calmest smile. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I just told the truth. I spoke about love and trust, about silence and rediscovery, and about the day I realized that losing everything wasn't the end. It was the clearing I needed to start over. When I finished, the applause wasn't loud. It was steady, the kind you feel instead of hear. That night, as I walked home under the streetlights, I thought about the box of maps, the long drive, the closed door, and I smiled. Because none of it broke me, it built me. These days, mornings come quietly. I make tea, open the windows, and listen to the wind in the trees. Sometimes I still think of Elias, not with anger, but with distance. There are wounds time doesn't close. It just teaches you to stop touching them. Legacy, I've learned, isn't what you leave to people. It's what you leave in them. And mine is finally alive again. So if you're listening, if you've ever been written out of your own story, forgotten, dismissed, or silenced, I want you to remember this. You don't need permission to take your place back. The table was never full. You were just waiting for the courage to sit down again. And once you do, they'll never be able to move your chair.